Jordan Peele is one of the modern masters of horror, and he has a long career on TV. Unfortunately, his biggest horror project on TV failed, exposing a harsh truth about TV. Before building a successful career in film, Jordan Peele started as a TV actor in the early 2000s. Peele's career began as an actor and writer for Mad TV, finding great success thanks to his comedic skills. Peele's time in the horror genre began in 2017 with his feature directorial debut Get Out, and he brought horror to TV with a reboot of The Twilight Zone. Unfortunately, it didn't succeed. Jordan Peele's The Twilight Zone reboot was promising, but it only lasted 2 seasons. Adam Scott as Justin confused on the plane in The Twilight Zone Nightmare at 30,000 feet. One of the best TV shows of all time, as well as one of the most influential ones, is The Twilight Zone. Created by Rod Serling, The Twilight Zone is an anthology TV series that brings together sci-fi, horror, fantasy, and drama, with some rare comedic episodes that, unsurprisingly, were quite divisive. Each episode of The Twilight Zone is a different story with a different cast, with many episodes now part of pop culture. The Twilight Zone aired from 1959 to 1964 for 5 seasons, becoming a classic and one of the best sci-fi TV shows ever. It's not surprising, then, that through the years, The Twilight Zone has been rebooted a couple of times, the most recent one thanks to Jordan Peele. In 2019, The Twilight Zone returned with Peele as host and executive producer. Peele's The Twilight Zone reboot followed the same format as the original show, with original stories, a remake of one of the original show's most famous episodes, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, and a sequel episode to 1962's To Serve Man. The Twilight Zone in the hands of Peele and company was promising, and though the show isn't bad and has some very good episodes, it wasn't the success many had expected it to be. The biggest criticisms of the third reboot of The Twilight Zone were that the episodes were too long, lacked creativity, and many were predictable. Unfortunately, The Twilight Zone only stayed for 2 seasons, each one with 10 episodes, and, sadly, none of them were memorable enough to make this reboot stand out, although I have to point out Season 1's replay as one of the reboot's best episodes. The Twilight Zone reboot's failure confirmed how ahead of the curve the original show was. The Twilight Zone in praise of Pip Max in the Mirror Room. As mentioned above, The Twilight Zone is one of the most influential TV shows of all time, popularizing the anthology format on TV and presenting engaging episodes with plot twists and endings with a moral. It would have been strange and, to an extent, unfair if The Twilight Zone had never been rebooted since it ended in 1964. However, the problem isn't that The Twilight Zone has been rebooted, but that none of the reboots matched the original. First was the movie, in 1983, with original stories and remakes of episodes, but, unfortunately, it's now remembered more for its behind-the-scenes tragedies than its quality. Then came the 1985 reboot, with adaptations of stories by various authors like Stephen King, and with writers like George R.R. Martin on board. The 1985 reboot ran for 3 seasons, and The Twilight Zone was rebooted once more in 2002, with Forest Whitaker as host. This version stayed for only 1 season, being the shortest Twilight Zone reboot to date. While it might seem easy to reboot The Twilight Zone, all attempts have failed because the original show was ahead of the curve. The Twilight Zone offered something new and stories that were either scary or so deep that they left the audience thinking about what they had just watched long after the episode ended. The reboots have focused too much on replicating certain episodes, even remaking some or giving them unnecessary sequels, instead of presenting unique stories covering current issues and themes, as well as some timeless ones, too. Perhaps the Twilight Zone reboots have tried too hard, but the weight of the legacy of the original show is surely heavy. We lived through the golden age of television, but nothing ever matched the Twilight Zone. Rod Serling smoking a cigarette in the original version of the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone arrived during the first golden age of TV, covering from the late 1940s to the early 1960s, and the second wave took place in the late 1990s up to 2023, though some will argue that it's still going. The latter began with The Sopranos, and it saw great TV shows across all genres. There have been great horror TV shows since The Twilight Zone's release, such as Twin Peaks, The Walking Dead, Evil, and many seasons of American Horror Story, but to this day, none has matched Serling's show. The influence of The Twilight Zone has been evident in many horror shows, and while some succeeded, their quality and impact can't compare to those of The Twilight Zone. 2 modern shows have captured the spirit of The Twilight Zone. Colin Rittman holding up a disc of his new game in Black Mirror Season 7 Episode 4. Image via Netflix. Despite no TV show matching the quality, impact, and greatness of The Twilight Zone, 2 modern sci-fi horror shows have gotten close to it. First is Black Mirror, created by Charlie Brooker, which initially aired on Channel 4 before moving to Netflix. Black Mirror is an anthology TV series, mixing sci-fi, drama, and horror. Each episode of Black Mirror is set in a future with advanced technology, exploring how this has changed and affected society, daily life, politics, the media, and more. Through this, Black Mirror comments on contemporary social issues, and these themes and sci-fi elements are what add horror to the show. Then there's Love, Death and Robots, an adult animated anthology TV series created by Tim Miller. Each episode of Love, Death and Robots is the work of a different animation studio, and they cover one or more of the title themes. Thanks to this, each episode of the show has a unique style, visual and narrative, and a different tone.